Welcome to Living Mirrors with Dr. James Cook. My guest this week is Dr. Rosalind Watts. Ros is a clinical psychologist working in psychedelic psychotherapy. She's worked as a clinical lead for Imperial College London's pioneering trial of psilocybin for depression, and now works as the clinical director at Synthesis Institute, a psilocybin retreat in the Netherlands. Dr. Watts' research focuses primarily on the mechanisms of psychedelic therapy, where she's explored the importance of acceptance, connection, and embodiment, which make up her ACE model of psychedelic integration. She's recently launched the ACER Integration community, an approach to psychedelic integration with a strong focus on nature connectedness. Hope you enjoy our conversation today.
Yeah, what's going on with the heat wave? I've just come back from Portugal. It was like, oh my
I'm
God.
actually in Portugal. I've moved here.
Are
So
you? Oh, have
yeah,
you?
really going through it. Yeah.
Whereabouts in Portugal are you?
So we're in Alentejo in the southern bit, on the border with the Algarve. It's like an hour north of the southern coast. So yeah, it's pretty hot.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
intense, isn't it? Ooh.
Yeah, we had some wildfires here recently, but luckily
Yeah,
everything's safe. And yeah,
yeah.
where were you in Portugal?
I was at Boom Festival, so
Oh, great.
Portugal, but it was
Yeah,
like a
yeah.
desert. It was like being in the desert for a week.
Yeah, we initially looked. So we're setting up a retreat center down here, and yeah, we initially looked around that region, Castelo Branco. It's very cheap land there, but it's cheap for a reason. It's pretty remote and accessible. And but yeah, I've never been to Boom. I'd love to go.
Oh, it's cool. Yeah, well, it's not cool. It's boiling hot. But
Right,
yeah.
it's on a lake, right? We've got a lot of
Yeah, thank God for the lake.
cool off there. Yeah.
Thank God for the lake. Oh, yeah.
So maybe we can dive in with for people not familiar with your work, a bit of your kind of background, your professional background, and how you came to work in psychedelics.
So, well, I'm a clinical psychologist by training, and I had quite a kind of traditional clinical psychology uh, trajectory, I guess. I actually originally wanted to work as a forensic psychologist because I worked in prisons and found that really interesting.
Oh well.
But then when I went on maternity leave, I had a bit of time to do a bit of kind of reading around other things that were emerging. And my best friend had been to an ayahuasca retreat. So she'd suffered from depression and she had gone to drink ayahuasca in Peru just to do some self-exploration. And I'd been quite surprised by how much it had helped her. I'd never heard of ayahuasca. This was like 10 years ago now. So I'd never even heard of it and thought it sounded quite dangerous. But she had a really powerful experience. So when I suddenly found myself with a bit of time on maternity leave, I started Googling, ayahuasca, and found that there was a psilocybin for depression clinical trial happening just down the road from where I lived. So I emailed them and asked if I could go and be a volunteer. I was just really intrigued. And I became an assistant guide on the first psilocybin for depression study at Imperial. And then it all just flowed from there, really.
Oh, great. Speaking of flowing, I think I saw in a documentary about those trials that you lived on the canals in London. I used to live on a houseboat in London as well.
Oh,
Yeah,
oh,
something about psychedelic
whereabouts?
neuroscientists. Yeah, I didn't have a mooring, so I would move around, or through the air, which was great.
Wow, constant cruising. That's very brave. That's
Yeah, it
hats
was a good
off.
adventure.
Yeah.
Yeah. um,
Hardcore.
yeah, so you were involved in this really early pioneering study at Imperial around psilocybin for depression you were mentioning. Maybe you could explain for people who aren't familiar with that work, the approach that people take with clinical approaches to psychedelics, this kind of very intentional therapeutic use as opposed to just kind of, the hit and miss recreational approach.
Yes. So yeah, well, and also because it was a clinical trial, everything was completely very much defined and
Right.
everything was manualized. So the clinical approach to psychedelic sessions has been pretty standardized, really. So there's three aspects of the treatment. There's the prep phase, the session itself, and then there's the integration. And studies pretty much always take that kind of format. The preparation phase, it varies how long people take, but essentially it's therapists, usually including a psychiatrist and a psychologist or talking therapist, getting to know a participant quite well. So the screening process is quite lengthy. In Imperial, we did brain scans with people as well, just to look at the before and after brain scans, MRI scans. But mainly the screening is around just checking that people have the resources to manage something like this and the social support for them afterwards in case it's a challenging experience. Then the preparation phase is all about orienting people to the mindset required for something like this, which is all about accepting difficult things and going towards difficult things. So in the psilocybin experience itself, people have quite a high dose of a psychedelic substance, and then there's no knowing where they will go. It's completely unpredictable. They could go to really painful places in their past, revisit traumas, or just feel lots of confusion and pain. And so, as well as, often they're really beautiful experiences, but they can be really difficult. And the main point of the preparation phase is to really orient people to really fully feel in their body that if something hard comes up, go towards it rather than away from it, because going away from it is always going to make it more difficult. But just going towards it, accepting it, and seeing what it can show you tends to work out better. So that's kind of the prep. There's lots of other things to cover too. Then there's the psychedelic. They have the capsules, and they have the therapists in the room, listen to music for the day. It's like an extended therapy session. And then the integration is whatever comes after, which can be a few sessions or longer. And that's really working out how the insights that you may have gleaned from the experience can affect your life going forward.
Right. And it seems that, the integration phase, the process can almost become mainly about integration, and the psychedelic kind of sessions themselves can almost be catalysts to bring up material. It becomes a project that's much bigger than just having an altered state experience, right? It's a kind of life-changing project therapeutically.
Yes, I mean, I think in a way we kind of always after an experience like this, you're kind of always integrating it in a way, because I think really they're about so much more than just what you encounter in the session itself. It's about really choosing to engage with the challenges in your life in a different way, because we're so used to taking medications that might help us kind of get on with things, or numb things, or distracting from things, or just trying to kind of cope. And there's something about a psychedelic session which is the opposite. It's about, okay, I'm really going to surrender to these feelings and face them. And I think once someone's decided to do that once, even if they never do it again, it subtly affects the rest of your life, because just the way you approach things will be different. So in the integration phase, challenging things that might come up, whether they're linked to the psychedelic session or just things in your life, there's that kind of new mantra about accepting rather than avoiding difficulties from that point onwards.
Right. Yeah, it really feels to me that part of the thing that's exciting about psychedelic medicine is it's almost a shorthand for this empowering way of approaching people's suffering, right? Where it's you are not a patient who is being diagnosed and prescribed prescribed something to get you functioning back, getting you back to work, but instead you're an agent who is kind of being empowered to go on your own journey, find out what your particular story is, and it's a really beautiful and completely different model to the way we tend to approach this stuff, which I think is why a lot of people have excitement that it's not just about introducing another treatment modality, but it has potentially more profound changes they could kind of bring to mental health care treatment.
I think so. I think the psychedelic session itself, in a way, I used to think that it would kind of demand a much more human approach to being with people when they're in difficult times, because a psychedelic session, you need to be open to whatever they want to explore. You need to be able to be much more led by them rather than directive and have a manual of what you think you're going to talk about. It's much more led by them. However, having said that, I think I used to think that the psychedelic setup, in a way, the fact that I think you need two therapists. So we tried doing it with one therapist, and it was so difficult to do that it really left us feeling in our team that you need two people there to hold a 6-hour session, because one of you needs to go to the loo, or, and also right. Just it can be incredibly intense as well, like the stuff that gets brought up. And it felt so nice to have both of us, especially because we were often in a male-female couple, so it felt kind of there was a reparenting aspect to it, I think, sometimes as well, that even though it's a little glimpse in time, just this one day, or actually in our trial we had 2 sessions, there was still something quite profound that could come from that day that you all spend together. But actually, as we're seeing psychedelics being brought into the mainstream, I don't know if we will see that model being adopted because it's so expensive. So we're seeing much more now of kind of take home psychedelic, like with ketamine, because that's legal,
Right.
home ketamine. And we'll see much more virtual therapists. So you just have like an online therapist on your laptop. So there is always a possibility that this radical potential of psychedelics will end up being, unfortunately, kind of slightly brought back into the, like, rather than radically changing the systems that we hoped it will, it might end up being incorporated into them instead. But
Right. Yeah, and I think there's an interesting spectrum there when it comes to kind of, talking about how these things can empower people to become agents in their own healing. And in one sense, there are people who, for decades have found healing throughout doing this stuff by themselves, without guides. So, but at the same time, the guides, with having two professionally trained guides, they're not, my instinct and understanding is they're not there to kind of gatekeep or, they're there to create a safe environment that can really scaffold your own healing. So it's not like there's less agency, there's potentially more agency in that space.
Totally. And I think because of the safety, because what you get with having those two guides there, at least in a clinical trial, is that we often didn't do very much. A lot of the time we really did just sit there. There was not that much skill involved. But I guess what happens is that for the participant, that they know that those guides have been vetted. So it wasn't so much about the particular training that we'd had. It was more about the fact that we'd been through healthcare professional training. So many different pairs of eyes had been on us. We'd had lots of case studies and videos watched. And, when you've been through a process where you've had to be checked and checked and checked, there is something about the safety there for people. I think it's not always the case. There have been high profile cases recently where some therapists guiding sessions have abused participants. So it's not a guarantee, but I do think there is something about the importance of people having been very thoroughly checked, because there's so much potential with this work for unresolved stuff within us to become amplified. There is a lot of power projected onto the therapists, and the participants are in a very vulnerable state. They're very suggestible under psychedelics. So I think what I really like the idea of is, rather than it being necessarily about kind of trained therapists always having to be there doing it, that like two of them, that you might have kind of community grassroots organizations where people who really love this work and feel they have a natural disposition. So people who are perhaps work as nurses, or people who perhaps work as carers, or people who just have that ability to hold space and be patient and be caring. And they might not have done specific training, but have the right temperament and really love it. That we could get kind of grassroots organizations of people who devote their time for free, donate their time. I don't know, I haven't got my head around how it worked with the payment, but a group of people that kind of give their time, and, like a kind of skills exchange, that people might pay those people back with other ways, and that you might need to have some structure in there with some, you perhaps need to have some health professionals and maybe a psychiatrist in there and a few other things. But I think essentially there's so much that can be done in the community, and that there doesn't need to be the effect of big money coming in, that as a grassroots community we can build the kind of structures around this work to keep it safe and also accountable, because within small communities there's really good accountability. So I think rather than it being these like big super franchises and big kind of commercial chains, I love the idea of it being something that kind of happens in the village, by the village, for the village.
Yeah, I completely agree. I've been thinking a lot in the same direction of grassroots community centers being a model, really being the model that would be most would be able to spread most efficiently, would be the most kind of potentially most healing, because in your work you've written a lot about kind of explored connection in community, and that being actually integral part of the healing process. So I think there's a good kind of theoretical reason as well that it makes more sense and just more empowering to people in general. And I think in America you see a range of narratives from, one very common narrative is, how are we going to roll out this life-changing medicine to so many people. Well, we need to go through big pharma route, and we need to get kind of this molecule, manufactured. And then you see other places where, on the West Coast, where things are decriminalized and people could kind of grow their own psilocybin mushrooms. And I'm not someone working as a kind of regulator in the pharmaceutical industry, but to me, the safety profile of the grown psilocybin seems reasonable to me. I don't think we need to be manufacturing pharmaceutical grade molecules to roll out globally. And that is very cheap and cost effective. So you can really imagine community organizations spreading very quickly. It's happening kind of, maybe the kind of thing that already happens in the underground happening in a way where there's very intentional kind of community coming together with guidance and very intentional approach to it.
Yes, exactly. And I think that, you're right. What I kind of hope is that things will develop in tandem, and that there maybe is a need for because I'm sometimes brought down and really humbled by people who, when I sometimes go off and on about how, we need to do the community approach and not big pharma. And it is something I tend to go on about a lot. Sometimes people who, will say at a talk or something, will say, I suffer from whatever condition. I want to do it in a hospital with a psychiatrist and a therapist. And so, and I want to do it with synthetic psilocybin. So I don't want to do it with stuff that you've picked out of the ground. I don't know how strong it is. So for some people, they really want that approach. So I do think having a multiplicity of approaches will be great. And that actually, when it comes through the kind of the pharma route, if that changed the licensing, that changed the laws, then there will be a time when everyone can just grow their own mushrooms anyway. So I think it'll be a question of like lots of different approaches. And what I'm really hoping we won't see much more of is this aggressive patenting or trying to monopolize or trying to control the market, because that's just so sad, isn't it? I mean, that's just so like, really? You're trying, like, I mean, that just feels like they've really missed the point of what we're trying to do here. So I'm hoping little phase of aggressive patenting will be a thing of the past.
Yeah, I think aggressive patenting of scientific things in general is, within academic science is seen as kind of absurd, because you have this huge chain of decades of work building on the shoulders of giants, and then the person who gets across the finishing line gets to take all the money. And when you look at psychedelics and you look at indigenous traditions, potentially going back millennia, and the kind of horrors of colonization stuff, the idea that someone at the end of that gets to say, I'll take all the money now from psilocybin, is really kind of absurd.
Yeah, completely.
Yeah. But unfortunately, it probably won't stop it happening. But I think you're right that like it might happen for a short period, but then people will cotton on that you don't need to go through big pharmaceutical industries. You can, and 100%. I think it's a really important point you made that, some of the early stages of psilocybin, were people with end of life anxiety for cancer. And so if you're in that demographic, and especially if you're already in a hospital, it totally makes sense. You're going to want controlled pharmaceutical grade, safe environment. You're not going to want to go to some community center thing. Whereas if you're a healthy young person, like your friend who wanted to explore ayahuasca, that could be an even safer option. Some kind of local community center thing that has more accountability than flying off to another country.
Yes.
Yeah. And so, sorry, you go.
No, you go.
Oh, I was just excited to move into the connection stuff. So you developed this model. And maybe we could go through the different stages if you want to explain the ACER model.
Yes. So yes, many different stages along the way. So it's been kind of finding myself in the psychedelic world and doing these studies, and I really felt quite amazed by what I saw, because having just been a little bit critical of the clinical model and the pharma model, we were using synthetic psilocybin in a clinical trial. And it was really amazing for the participants. They felt very safe. They had these very medicalized treatments. And for many of them, they were much, much more effective than the treatments that they'd had before. So I got very, very excited by this and started to feel for the first couple of years like this was the thing, and that, psychedelic therapy was going to change the world, and that we just needed to get it for as many people as possible, as quickly as possible, and that the ends justified the means, just got to get it out there. And you can probably tell from my tone that I've, don't feel quite the same way now, but it was a very exciting time. And I realized then that Well, the most exciting thing was doing some qualitative research with the participants in the first trial. That was a small trial of just 20 people with treatment-resistant depression. They all had 2 doses of psilocybin, and I interviewed them all about, had 6 months after the trial finished for them, about did it help you, and if so, why? What do you think changed? And there were these 2 very strong themes that came out, that yes, it had helped, and that what seemed to have changed was that people went from feeling quite avoidant of emotion, difficult emotion, quite numb, to being able to really accept it and feel it and sit with it. As I said earlier, the second theme, well, actually the theme that was the strongest, was that people described going from a feeling of being quite disconnected from themselves, from other people and the world around them, to feeling very connected to those things temporarily for a few months. So it was like they were kind of, they described depression in a way, I mean, I'm kind of like paraphrasing, but this was the impression I got from speaking to all 20 of them, that their experience of depression were all different, but that in general, it was like their lives had gone from being big and full to shrinking down until they were just existing in like a little prison in their heads. They were just trapped in here. Constant rumination, constant negative thinking, finding it hard to engage beyond that. And that what psilocybin had done, it just made that kind of that concentric circle that had got so small suddenly expand out again. And so almost in the space of a day, they could connect to their body, their senses, their emotions. Suddenly things would look much more beautiful, like nature looked much more beautiful. The people on the street seemed much more, they wanted to talk to the person in the shop. It was connection, this beautiful broad scale connection. And sometimes people connected to a spiritual principle or a sense of universal love. So it was this very sweeping process of connecting. And yeah, it seemed to me like that process of going from avoidance to acceptance and going from disconnection to connection really reminded me of a type of therapy that I trained and studied as a clinical psychologist called acceptance and commitment therapy. It just has so many themes in common. And so I kind of merged the two and came up with a model that was called Accept, Connect, Embody. And it was a model for kind of manual for doing a psychedelic journey. And the key component of it was this visualization exercise where you imagine that before the psilocybin session, when you're kind of preparing for it, you imagine going on a deep sea dive in the sea, swim out to the water, waves are crashing against you, there's kind of ruminative thoughts, that sense of being stuck in a rut, treading water. And then taking the psilocybin capsule is like diving down beneath the surface of that sea, diving down into your deepest parts of yourself and really accepting the stuff on the seabed, looking through all the silt and the spiky shells, and then opening up to them, finding a pearl, which is the insight, the lesson in the pain, swimming up to the surface, and then bursting up into this kind of beautiful pink sunset and being able to see your life differently because of this pearl that you've discovered. So that was essentially the first model, which was a model for preparing for a psychedelic session, going through a psychedelic session, and integrating a psychedelic session.
Right. And then so if we focus in on the acceptance part, is it this term experiential avoidance? Does that come from acceptance and commitment therapy?
Yes, it does. Yes.
Right. That seems like a really useful concept. I mean, generally, I think once people go through a kind of therapeutic psychedelic experience, the idea of experiential avoidance suddenly makes a lot of sense. So that's how they've been living their life until that point.
Exactly. So yes, experiential avoidance is that sense of just kind of saying no to things that feel a bit difficult. So just distracting, avoiding, being a lot in your head, because actually being a lot in our head, right, constant thinking, we're avoiding our embodied experience. So experiential avoidance includes that sense of just thinking a lot is a way of numbing our sensations and our embodied feelings. So experiential avoidance is something that we're all very used to. We have worlds that are built for it. We have easy ways of going from morning till nighttime with constant different ways of experiential avoidance, Netflix and substances, drinking, food. There's just so many ways, that shopping, gambling, there's just a million ways we numb. And experiential avoidance, coming out of that, you're left with a very uncomfortable an unpleasant, often, situation of just sitting with yourself when there's nothing else to focus on and you're just there and you feel all the unresolved things, maybe a bit of boredom, maybe a bit of shame, confusion, those feelings that we haven't kind of, well, it's I think it's when we haven't yet met our, so another aspect of the acceptance and commitment therapy, which I really love because it's come from the Steve Hayes, who developed it, has a spiritual practice, and I think many aspects of this resonate with Buddhism and spiritual traditions. But one of the other aspects, as well as thinking a lot about experiential avoidance, is about meeting your larger self. So in ACT, they talk about the observer self, or self as context. And that is an idea, an analogy for describing that. It's self with a capital S, like the Jungian archetype of self, big self, not little ego self. And the analogy they use is like being the sky rather than the weather. So being bigger than something. But there's something, if you think about a blue sky that just goes on and on forever, like when you go above the clouds in an aeroplane, before the clouds, it's all turbulent and grey. And then you go up higher and there is that part of the sky that's just, there's just the sun and the blue sky forever and ever and ever. It's completely undamageable, completely permanent. And I think there's something about feeling that place or tasting that place and knowing that you are bigger than the thunderclouds and the rain, that when you can feel that place, you can kind of sit more easily with the difficult stuff and feel it and let it know that it's there, because you know that you're more than that too. So I think it's both. It's being able to face the spiky stuff that's there and feel how murky and icky and unpleasant it is, from a point of knowing that you also have the blue sky always within you, even when you can't feel it.
Right. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think that experience of the kind of the big self that's just kind of awake, accepting, open consciousness, just in which everything arises, is, that is it can't be tainted by the contents. It's like things arising in a mirror or the blue sky. No matter how stormy it gets, it can't be damaged by it, right? So when you learn to have that experience, and I think this fits in, with classic things people talk about in psychedelic experience of ego dissolution and ego death. Even I'm not a big fan of that term, but yeah, this shifting into realizing that the structure of mind is, there is this canvas, this background, this bigger self that, whatever word you want to use for it, consciousness, or I think even this is where people often, you mentioned kind of love as a spiritual principle. Because it's so, we talk about acceptance, right? It's a state of mind that's fully accepting, fully aligned with whatever's arising in, and that's, so love to me seems like it's kind of a very loving way of being. So what I like in the use of these different terms of acceptance, connection, and embodiment, they all seem to really relate to each other as well. They're not like separate. They're really useful concepts to look at this single. Maybe it's single phenomenon, maybe it's not, but so it feels to me that when you accept something, we were talking about experiential avoidance and kind of how being kind of dissociated in rational thought and being up in your head can really distance you from the intensity of felt emotion, and in that mode, actually, that's where the suffering happens, right? The kind of Jungian idea of what you resist persists. And then if you come into your body, and in the embodiment part, through accepting whatever's arising in your body, that's how you come into connection, because connection is through our senses, right? Through our kind of embodied feeling of the world. So I think it's a really nice way of linking together all those different things.
Yes. And actually, it's interesting you say that about the embodiment being the kind of the route to the connection, because actually in the more recent analogy that I've used, so I've for after the session itself, so you've got the pearl dive in the actual session, but then afterwards it's like, okay, well, what do you do with that pearl? You plant it like it's a seed and you let it grow into a tree. So like a kind of, pearls don't normally grow into trees, but we can use our imagination. So, and the idea of the tree then becomes those three parts of accept, connect, embody, because the roots of the tree is acceptance, the stuff that's in the shadow, the stuff that's in the earth, it's hard to look at, it's the deep stuff, the history. And it's the inner. And then you have the branches, which are a mirror image of the roots. The branches of the tree are a mirror image. And that's all about connection, reaching out into the light. Which direction do you want to grow towards? It's about meaning, purpose. But the roots of the tree and the branches, the acceptance and the connection, are connected by the trunk. And the trunk is the body. It's the sensing in the here and now. And the body is the place where the suffering of the past becomes the meaning of the future, becomes the meaning of, it becomes the purpose, it becomes the growth through feeling it in the trunk of your tree. And I think it's nice to remember that, because it can feel so overwhelming when we have, traumatic experiences in our past, difficult things to deal with. And, sometimes the idea of purpose can be overwhelming for people. Like, I don't know what my purpose is. I don't know what I want to do or what my values are. But it's like, all you need to do is come back to the trunk of your tree, come back to your breathing, come back to this present moment, and just stay with your feelings, and just stay with the sensations that are arising, and know that that is the place where, if you can stay with that, that's where the transmutation, the alchemy is going to happen. And that's where it happens in psychedelic session too. It happens in every moment when you're present in each moment. And I think in so much of our lives, we're not present in the moment. That is what experiential avoidance is. You resist the moment, you resist what's there. And I think there's such power when you can. I mean, it's like the Ram Dass. I was looking at the book, the Be Here Now book by Ram Dass, that awesome book with those amazing pictures. And I never really looked at it properly, but on every page, it's just like, it's really simple, guys. Just try and be here now, because that's where the energy is. But even one moment where we can really be where we are right now is so powerful. And we spend so much time pushing it away. And I think one of the reasons why psychedelic sessions are effective for people with depression and other things is because if your life is really challenging and you're in resistance and contact with the present moment feels impossible or overwhelming, psychedelics tend to overwhelm those what's the word? Those kind of resistances, defenses. And because the feelings can be so intense, you are brought back to the present moment, because in a way, all you can do is be with the intensity of where you are. You can't really think about what you did last week or what you might do tomorrow. You're just in the now. And that's a real balm for us, at least people in the West anyway.
Right. Yeah. And the focus in your work on connection, I've really appreciated, because I think it seems that, in order to, if you were to say, connection is therapeutic psychologically, initially someone may not have an understanding of why that would be. And it seems to me that if you're going to move in the direction of connection, it requires you to do all of this work. It requires you to come out of the avoidance, to come into the embodiment, and also to do it in a way that's safe. So, in the therapeutic setting, you're hopefully being given a space that is safe. But it seems that to me that the process is one of really learning to trust your own ability to navigate the world, to make sure you're safe, to resource yourself in a way where, as you said, like, you can safely come into your breathing. If you're in the middle of a panic attack and you have no idea how to manage it, really focusing on your breathing may not be the best thing to do in that moment. In kind of trauma-informed mindfulness, there's often a lot of things like, be aware that focusing on breath can be triggering for some people. So discovering yourself and your history and the way you operate and resources to help you navigate in the world, seems to me that this role of safety and the way it comes into this empowered kind of mode of growth seems really important, and that's one aspect, I think, of why connection can be healing. But I'd really like to hear your thoughts on why this connection is therapeutic.
Yeah, I love what you say about the importance of that safety in order to feel it and come into more of that, because you're opening up. So in order to open up, you need to be held by a container. What I love about the analogy of the trees is that underneath the roots, the place of acceptance, the roots of the trees all joined together by the mycelial networks, the mushrooms, the fungi. So they connect the trees of the forest together. And I think that's the real safety, that sense of connection with each other. So one of the things I've really enjoyed the most is observing the process of participants on the clinical trials meeting each other and working with each other, because many of them before had individual talk therapy or medications. And they might have known a few other people that suffered from depression, but ultimately they suffered alone, they struggled on, they wanted their partners, their family members, or their children to think they were okay. They didn't want to bring them down. And so they really pushed forward with their life, living a kind of half life or wearing a mask to try and make things easier for other people. And that there was this experience of people meeting each other and saying, yeah, I suffer from really severe depression. I have for many decades. Yeah, so do I. We've been trying psychedelics to help open us up. Okay. And the opening of the psychedelics has catalyzed a very deep sharing from those people. Excuse me. And I think from that, observing people feel those mycelial connections underneath their individual trees and knowing that other people suffer from the same things, that their sense of shame or their sense of constant self-criticism, that everyone else in the, you know, we do Zoom sharing circles, everyone else in the Zoom sharing circle says, yeah, like me too. There is something about that sense of me too. I think collectively as a culture, we've been so avoidant of mental health, talking about mental health. COVID has just blown it open. Now we realize that, you know, mental health is that it's much more common to really suffer with what's going on in your mind than to not. That's the conclusion I've come to, really, that it's much more common to be struggling with ourselves, the world around us, and our relationships than to just be thinking that everything's hunky-dory. So once we've accepted, it's like, oh, right, okay. So we're all really struggling, even if we don't have mental health difficulties previously. We're living on a kind of planet that is expiring. You know, we're very aware of the effects of that now. We're seeing political shifts that are frightening. So we have the internet now so that we can see all these things happening more. We're a more polarized society. So there is so much to hold right now that we just need each other. And so I think for me, the connection, the kind of description of connection we've just developed a measure for measuring connection. And the way we describe it is like basically connecting to self, others, and world. It's like, it includes all of that. You can have one of the subtypes or all three, but it's self, others, world. But for me, I think there's something about coming back into connection with each other. There's been a lot of focus on personal development, personal therapy, individualized therapy, like me trying to sort out me in my own brain. But this coming into our communities and being service to each other and connecting to something bigger and deeper than just our own individual selves. I think that for me is where the real transformational potential lies, because psychedelics have been used as a communal tool. They've been used in retreat settings for many years. The indigenous use of these plant medicines was pretty much always in groups rather than individuals. And as we said before, we need a range of approaches to suit different people's needs. But I think doing this work in groups, and even if you don't do the actual session in groups, doing the integration in groups, observing each other's vulnerabilities, hearing other people talk about ups and downs, it's so soothing. And also, not only does it help us feel better about ourselves because it normalizes things, it's also enables us to develop our empathy. Because when you really hear someone talking about something and you see their face break into that kind of expression of despair, you feel your heart go out to them. And I think, we're quite numbed. We flood ourselves with television. Sometimes there's a kind of empathy exhaustion because there's just so much stuff to worry about. It's like, well, there's too many things to care about. I'm just going to focus on my little world. There's something beautiful about really hearing each other speaking about our emotions and our vulnerabilities that allows our hearts to expand as well.
Absolutely love everything you just said. There's so many things I want to come in on that. I listened recently, there was a Ram Dass talk, speaking of Ram Dass, about the theme was how to keep your heart open in hell. And it was the idea, there's so much, as you say, like there can be kind of empathy overload in terms of so much suffering in the world, and talking about just that as a practice. There is no oh, you just do this. No, it's difficult. It's it tests our limits, but it's just an ongoing practice. But yeah, I love the idea of the mycelium connecting the trees and their social networks. And I think you're totally right that we're a social animal, and it totally makes sense that part of our issue now is the severing of those networks of social support. We're both British, and my experience of British culture is of very much encouraging the kind of stiff upper lip, keep your issues to yourself, carry the burdens, kind of Second World War blitz mentality of we just keep going on. And you can see why that arose. You can even see it comes from a kind of almost a noble place of like, don't burden other people. We're all struggling, but it's not that it's like a nasty impulse or something, or that you don't want to help others. It's more that it's just unwise. I think you end up seeing that the wise thing to do is to attempt to build structures of support, because it's not going to go away. We're all just kind of carrying our burdens and keeping them in. And for me, it was really my own kind of journey was one of realizing things I valued around stoicism and being able to kind of be resilient and keep going and keep things in. Even though I knew there were toxic versions of this, I thought the ones that I valued were positive versions of that. So resilience sounds like a good thing, right? But it's realizing that actually to be a human is to be allowed to be messy, or to be a human in a healthy context, I would say, is to be able to lean on others and to be supported by them, and you'll support others at different times. And especially with male conditioning, it's that's not something you're taught, is that that's actually the wise, healthy way to be, is to be slightly messy, slightly not be just kind of stoic and resilient and keeping going all the time. And there's a way to do this that is resilient and a stronger, leaves everyone stronger in the end, rather than, I think people's fear is almost like the dominoes collapsing. Like, if this person needs support, like, well, I need support as well. And there's a scarcity. I think that's the thing, there is actually currently a scarcity in the culture of support. So if we can create that, if we can get culture change where we see the wisdom of this, and that's why I think we're completely on the same page around community centers as a necessary part of this.
Yes, absolutely. It's so true what you say as well about male conditioning, and just, that idea, because the messiness is just the honesty. Like, it's just the honesty. Like, it's such a beautiful quality and so strong to be able to, like, the strength of honesty. It's the strongest thing. The truth is it's the strongest thing we have. Everything else just collapses and folds. But that we try, and we have this reverse idea of what it means to be strong, to be able to be vulnerable. I mean, I think Brené Brown's done amazing work in kind of really bringing forward this discussion around the strength of vulnerability, the power of vulnerability, and how resourcing it is for everybody, because you just kind of all know where you stand, and things don't suddenly all come crashing down because something that seemed like it was okay wasn't. When we can, day by day, I mean, it comes back to that same thing about feeling your feelings in the moment and having a language for it. I mean, I think communicating about these things is another thing that's hard. We need to develop a whole language and a whole tradition around how we even say these things. And I think kind of ceremony culture is helping us, why so many people want to go to Peru and places and have psychedelic ceremonies. I think all the ritual that's there, it provides a container. Like, for example, in the San Pedro it's cactus ceremonies, which is where people ingest some cactus and it has mescaline in it, and they have a ceremony and they sing, and at the end of it there's a fire, and they take up pieces of wood and they throw the piece of wood in the fire, and each one represents something that they want to let go of. And there's something about that ritual and other rituals where you can kind of really symbolize or embody something within something concrete, or use metaphors or just any structures for taking that nebulous, unpleasant feeling of like fear and turning it into something we can name and share with other people and talk about. Is I think one of the reasons it's so hard to be honest about our feelings is because we almost don't really have a language for it. We don't have the words, and we don't have the settings and the forums where we can risk saying how we feel, and risk and not risk being shunned, because ultimately we're, as you say, we're social creatures, and we're wired to belong because it's safe to belong and it's not safe to be shunned. So often we're monitoring what we say and what we do to avoid social rejection. And when those norms all change, and when we start to really add social value to the people who can own mistakes, own shadow, acknowledge difficult things, that will be good. Yeah,
I think you're totally right about developing a whole culture around this, because when I experienced this working well, it's it really feels like I have to bring to bear all of my kind of emotional, cognitive, like intellectual abilities to kind of, if there's some kind of interpersonal issue and I don't know why I'm feeling the way I'm feeling, and I want to analyze it and communicate and be like, okay, what's going on here? Let's unpick this. It's not trivial. It's really quite involved, and it becomes a kind of almost like for me, like the centerpiece skill of life is learning this, as it's a constant practice, and it's a joyous one as well. It feels like you're constantly growing and discovering, and it's not like some chore you have to do. But it is in a sense of like, if we all understand you have to get the housework done, that if you let that slip, everything else in a sense is kind of second to making sure that you've not got rats kind of coming into your house and eating food that's left everywhere. We don't really talk about it because we all get it, and we all are told to clean our room when we're young, and we get brought up in this culture. I think there's a similar thing with these emotional skills where hopefully decades from now it would just be everyone kind of knows and kind of teaches each other, and we're doing it, and our emotional house is tidy instead of
I love that analogy. And that it's just there's no it's just what needs to be done for things to be safe. I
think we've just somehow lost that practice, and then I mean the speaking of our Britishness is hopefully now, I think it's not a coincidence that we're of the culture that was unwise enough to kind of try and destroy these traditions in indigenous communities and through colonialism, and I think that's very tied up with not having them, somehow having lost them ourselves, and trying to skillfully relearn them in a way that's not appropriative and acknowledges what's happened in the past. It's more and more I realize the importance of just the concept of practice, that there aren't really simple solutions to this. We're just all collectively going to keep moving forward together and trying to grow and discover in this space.
And it's often everything is so nuanced as well, because I was on a panel at festival a few weeks ago with a great journalist who was hosting the panel, and she's from Canada, and she made a comment about, if I see somebody at one of these psychedelic festivals, like a white person in a Native American headdress, I'm going to go and that person's getting a piece of my mind if they're lucky, if they're not lucky, they're getting a piece of much more. Like she was, and it took me like a second, and I was like, of course, like our lack of education, our lack of understanding about those issues, the fact that the genocides that have happened from white people to Native American cultures, it's like, why would we? I mean, it's so insulting that you would see somebody wearing a Native American headdress, and yet at the same time, I thought about it, and I realized that 10 years ago, it was more than 15 years ago, I remembered being at a festival with with a family member, child, and he saw a Native American headdress and wanted one, and I bought it for him, and he was walking around wearing it, and I was like, I did it myself, and it reminded me, because I can be quite judgmental about things. It's like, remember that underneath that headdress is just this longing for, as you say, reconnecting with something that's deeper, reconnecting with a different culture, reconnecting with that indigenous spirit that we've lost and we're hungry for. And so I do get quite cross at the extractivism we see with mainstream psychedelic companies who are kind of, as you say, there's like lineages of many thousands of years of work and carrying the culture and the tradition, and then a white guy in a company patents it, gets the money. Are any of those benefits shared with the people who carried the tradition? No. Is there any consideration even often to those communities? Usually not. So it is quite infuriating, but at the same time, you can see that what those companies would probably say is, we are hungry for this. The West needs this too. And if we're going to bring it in a way that's going to be mass, like if it's going to reach a lot of people rather than just a few privileged people that can afford to go on retreats in Peru, if we want it to actually change the culture, we have to bring it in using the structures that are already existing, because we need to do it now because we don't have very long. So it's all very nuanced, and I think what it requires of, like, exactly what you're saying about the emotional housekeeping around how we speak to each other, how we can try and stay connected in the psychedelic community, because there's lots of different factions, And I'm speaking as someone who's in the past been very critical of different aspects of it too, but really feeling that sense of like, well, if we can't all speak with each other, and if we can't in the psychedelic fields find ways of communicating with each other and letting it in and not polarizing, if we can't have these conversations within this field, then we need to be able to do it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that completely links in what we're talking about, this kind of interpersonal practice of communication and being emotionally aware. And because especially when it comes to these, with the Native American headdress example, or people appropriatively using things in psychedelic space, being able to hold both perspectives. And, I think what typically happens now, what I see a lot of is, the person at the festival who's wearing the headdress who doesn't want to hear about it, there's a, if they're, because we don't live in the culture that you and I would, think is the wise direction to move in, where there is a scarcity of emotional support and of kindness, really, and of understanding and of compassion. There's a defensiveness, and especially if you've come out of your own suffering and you in these indigenous traditions you found healing, and suddenly someone comes and goes, well, actually, there could be a panicked response of like, no, shut that down. Like, I don't care. Like, I need this. And instead of an understanding of kind of, oh, actually, I hear what you're saying, and so this is politically problematic, but maybe there's a way for me to, move forward in a way that we can both benefit. I'm not causing harm whilst I'm benefiting from it. And at the same time, when someone does something wrong, this is what I was talking about being messy earlier as well, not losing touch with people's humanity. Like the thing you were talking about of kind of pointing the finger and moralizing and say and being kind of holier than thou, realizing that we should. I mean, I almost want to say for my own personal experience of overcoming, problematic levels of resilience and or stoicism. I feel like what would have been helpful for me to hear is actually encouragement to be a bit more messy in the way we were talking about, in a where I am being more vulnerable and leaning on people more in a way that's not in a way it's still responsible, but it's this. The idea that we all have to be perfect, and that if we're not, then we're going to be moralized too, and we're shamed, and it triggers those kinds of young parts of ourselves that are afraid of rejection. And we just need to be aware that all of this stuff is in the mix. I feel like we don't tend to talk about this stuff. Stuff gets kind of reduced onto whatever the conversation seems to be about, but underneath it, there's huge amounts of emotional stuff. And socially, I think the majority of it is emotional, but we lack the ability, the language to see that and to hold multiple perspectives and to come to kind of conflict resolution and compassionate understanding. But again, we're having this conversation and touching all these topics because they all do interlink. And I think the trajectory that you kind of beautifully illustrate with the visualizations and the metaphors really brings together all these different components and I hope can, by sharing your voice here, can help people in their own journeys to kind of, to move in this direction of bringing together all these threads, because it is complex, but it's strange. It's like, it's complex, but it's also very simple. Like when you're in those moments of release and connection and openness, it's just this. I stop resisting, and suddenly I'm connected, I'm accepting, I'm embodied, I'm healing. It's really one simple thing, but it touches on absolutely everything.
Absolutely. And I think one of the things when you were saying before about kind of problematic levels of stoicism, I think the speed at which we live now, just the amount of sheer things, because I guess, with technology, there's just so much more that we do in a day and that we're expected to do. Everything's just ramping up and up and up and up and getting bigger and bigger and just expanding. And there's just way too much. I mean, Pretty much everyone I know is just super stressed, exhausted. There's modern life is burning us out. So it's hard. I mean, the visualizations that I've done, so the tree visualizations, which are for ACER. So the ACE model was the Pearl Dives for clinical trials, like psychedelic therapy. Then I added the R on, which stands for restore. And that's a year-long process for integrating insights, whether they're from psychedelic journeys or just from life. But so it's accept, connect, embody, restore. And that's using all the tree metaphors. And that's because there's in the ACER model, there's a 12-month process where every month there's a different tree, and every tree represents a different lesson. And we go, as a community, we go around these 12 trees together. And each month there's a tree journey where you spend, it's like 25 minutes with this playlist, and there's a guided narrative where you essentially kind of go and sit down by a tree and merge with the tree and breathe as the tree. So you're breathing in carbon dioxide and breathing out oxygen, and you feel the roots going down, and you feel your trunk of your body is the trunk of the tree. And it's all about that process of transmuting the stuff at the roots into the growth at the branches. And it takes, it's like 25 minutes. And when I've talked to people about like the ACER community, it's like 25-minute tree journey, and then there's a couple of sharing circles, and then there's a bit of breath work. So it's like, it's like an hour a week essentially, or 2 hours a week, an hour and a half. People are like, I couldn't fit it in. And I'm the same. I'm like, and in order to be able to, you said that we need more kindness. And I completely agree. We also need more slowness and more resting and more stopping.
Right.
Because when we're activated and our nervous systems are on, fight, flight, we can't come into that soothed place of connection. There's actually a brilliant book called Anchored by Deb Dana. I don't know if I'm saying her name right, Deb Dana. And it's about polyvagal theory, about anchoring the nervous system in safety and connection. It's a beautiful, beautiful book. And I just realized how, until we can step off the treadmill and actually take time and acknowledge that taking time means saying no to things that we desperately want to do or feel really important. So it means exposing ourselves to the feeling of unsafety because we're like stepping off the mainframe. Until we can do that, I don't think it's going to be that easy for us to develop that, as you say, like emotional literacy and housekeeping and keeping our emotional house in order. Because when you're living in a kind of constant barrage of chaos, where there's like fires and this and that, you can't ever slow down and sit around the fire together. So
Right.
Yeah, kindness and saying no to a lot of stuff.
Right. And I think what you just described there maybe is partly why people feel psychedelics have this potential for kind of truly global transformation. Whether or not, it's as simple as that, or if that happens is another issue. But I think that recognition that we live in a global kind of economic system that is about perpetual kind of not just being on a treadmill, but accelerating the treadmill, the speed, and it's about kind of bringing more and more people into circuits of production and doing more all the time, growth to, so that it's just our entire way of life is not about stepping aside and prioritizing well-being and all these other things. So you can imagine, I think, community centers forming around psychedelic medicine and then deciding, my values, we have enough of this here to go and buy some land and farm it and live a simple life. And you can imagine a situation where more and more of that happens, and there is a kind of truly global transformation. Now that's the most idyllic, simple, picture. There's a lot of complexities there, but it's definitely something worth speaking about, because it wakes people up to the thing you're describing. They're brought up in a situation where they think it's normal to be running at full pelt and to be stressed out and to not be able to get support. And then they can just have a few hours, with a psilocybin journey where they feel release, they feel connection, and they think, oh wait, this is what I wanted. Unconsciously, this sense of peace and of connection, of just being is what we're all we think we're chasing, but actually that's an illusion that we're ever going to get there by running on the treadmill.
Yes.
Yeah,
that idea that if you can just do this thing, then you'll get that feeling of peace and be able to relax. And just when you realize that that's never, it's never going to come, and that the pursuit of perfection is a very lonely and damaging pursuit.
Yeah. And psychedelics might help people to kind of just step off the treadmill and realize that they're already where they need to be. They don't need to be running to it. And
also just nature. I mean, it's like, consumerism count. I mean, I love the documentary Century of the Self. Have you seen the Century of the Self?
Oh, right. Yeah.
Adam Curtis, and talks a lot about kind of consumerism and how it was a fascinating idea. It's about how after the Second World War, there was this fear of human instinct, the fact that humans could have come together and committed such atrocities as the Holocaust together. They could have allowed something like that, and so many people contributed to this behavior. There was this sense of like, oh, humans in packs are bad. It was this Freudian idea of having the drives, the id, the dark part of ourselves that could do bad things in packs. So consumerism was almost quite consciously brought in to kind of nullify us, keep us in boxes. So put all the people in their little individual boxes, washing machines, give them all the things to nullify them, keep them happy, just keep them focused on the next model of phone or trainers that they want. So it was brought in as this kind of like conscious way of like keeping us contained, but it's all based on this idea of human beings as essentially kind of bad and dangerous. When you come into this idea of like, oh, but if like the essential part of ourselves is like the blue sky, we have that flicker of blue sky in us, like the larger self. It's actually there's a beauty and a love at our core. Then it becomes the idea of living together collectively becomes less frightening and possible to like, well, let's have another go at that, because let's see if we have more tools and new practices and new ways of working with things. Let's try again, because the consumerism aspect of things is just so, well, it's just so damaging. And I guess it's like near to Imperial, where we did the studies, there was this huge American style shopping mall, massive. And inside, we'd sometimes go there because we needed to get a new speaker for the room or something that had broken. And it was always amazing in there, even in summer, how many people were in the shopping mall. And they had this like fake forest. They had these like beautiful white sparkling trees, and just this sea of thousands of people like in the forest, in the shopping mall with their plastic bags. And it's like, if psychedelics can do one thing really reliably, it's help people look at a leaf, an actual real breathing leaf or a rose, and go, oh my, like, this is the most beautiful thing. I can't believe that these things exist and that we don't spend all of our time looking at them. Like, how are we not looking at flowers all day? And it's such a beautiful shift when you realize the power of nature, and you don't need to buy stuff so much, and actually just be in the trees. That's a powerful shift that I think is coming.
Yeah, definitely. Oh, thanks so much for your time, Ros. I've really, really enjoyed this. Where would you send people to online if they want to look into your work more?
For people that are interested in psychedelic therapy models for psychedelic therapy, whether they want to be therapists or they're going to go to a retreat or a clinical trial, I would say the ACE model manual is online, open access. So if you go to Psych Archive, you can just access that all with all the visualization scripts and everything. If people are interested in joining an integration community, this is the ACER model, the trees, then the website is coming out soon. So by the time this comes out, it'll be there. And that's acerintegration.com.
Okay, excellent. Yeah, I'll put some links in the description as well. And thank you again.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It was lovely to chat.
Thanks for listening. If you're watching on YouTube, please like and subscribe. And if you want to help the podcast reach a wider audience, you can leave a review on Apple Podcasts. Finally, if you want to offer financial support, you can go to patreon.com/Dr. James Cook.